Lecture 35, Geoffrey Chaucer, Life and Works.
Welcome yet again to our series of lectures on the literature of Europe's Middle Ages. In our last lecture, number 10, we returned to England. This time, in number 11, we turn to the Gawain poet's more famous contemporary, Geoffrey Chaucer. Now, context, it seems to me, is important in understanding the work of any author. There are certainly those formalist literary critics who would deny that, who would say we just read a text, period, and we don't attempt to attach it to a world. In my own view, context is important, and so in attempting to come to grips with Chaucer, we're going to look a little at his life, we're going to look a little at the kinds of literary influences that demonstrably affected him, and we're going to look at some aspects of the England in which he lived. Now, in this lecture, we're also going to consider some of Chaucer's fine, but possibly less famous works. In our next lecture, we will turn to the Canterbury Tales, the text that everyone most commonly associates with the name Chaucer. We know pretty certainly that Chaucer died in London on the 25th of October in 1400. Only through prodigies of scholarly detective work is it possible to suggest that he was born in about 1343. We haven't time here to track down all of this detective work, but he's born about 1343. He dies towards the end of October in 1400. Chaucer's father, John, was a wine merchant who had held minor administrative posts in London. Chaucer's mother, Agnes, came from a solid family of landowners. They weren't wealthy and they weren't aristocratic, but it was a good, solid family. Now, when the Black Death went through England in 1349, somewhat ironically, it wiped out a substantial portion of both John's and Agnes's families, and they, therefore, received much larger inheritances than they would ever have had any reason to expect, and as a result, young Chaucer grew up in rather comfortable surroundings in London. The Black Death had this ironic effect. It devastated some families and sometimes benefited others. Nothing is known certainly about Chaucer's education. Biographers have for years imagined all sorts of possibilities simply because he was such a capable and competent writer and so on, but we really don't know about his education. His boyhood we can evoke, but we cannot document. That is to say, he spent his life in an area of London frequented by merchants. He was, as I said a moment ago, raised in rather comfortable surroundings. So it may very well have been the case, for instance, that passing acquaintance with traders, merchants, visitors, sailors from a variety of places began building his formidable collection of stories. It may have begun his considerable familiarity with foreign languages, not least Italian. That'll come back in our considerations later on. But as I say, all of this is entirely plausible, and absolutely none of it can be documented. In 1357, Chaucer was a page in the house of Elizabeth, the Countess of Ulster. Her husband was Lionel, the Duke of Clarence, a son of King Edward III. Now, Chaucer's time in this aristocratic household, in this court, may have permitted him to polish his education. It will have permitted him an opportunity to observe closely the life and the mores of the highest nobility. It will have given him opportunities to gain insights into politics. It will have given him opportunities to hear and to read courtly literature. Now, again, all of that is entirely plausible, and you can't really document any of it. Between the 1360s and the eve of his death, Chaucer held a variety of responsible and sometimes onerous official positions. He traveled frequently on diplomatic missions, sometimes on official and public business, sometimes on very sensitive private business, both for kings and for members of the aristocracy. Again, he had insights into the behavior of the highest classes of England, he had insights into the great political issues of the age, and he had a chance to travel, to go other places, to meet other people, to gain insights into other cultures. In 1366, Chaucer married Philippa de Roodt. She had served in the Queen's chamber. So his wife also would have had considerable knowledge of the court and of the Queen's court and of the ladies at court and so forth. They appear to have had two sons, Thomas and Louis, both of whom went on to really quite distinguished careers after their father's death. Legend has attributed to Chaucer sometimes one and sometimes two daughters. There's really no evidence that he had daughters. Now, where Chaucer's literary achievements are concerned, it is, first of all, it seems to me, important simply to acknowledge that it's really hard to pin down the exact ways in which Chaucer came by his prodigious familiarity with a wide array of literary conventions and a wide array of specific works. We just really cannot say confidently. With a figure like Petrarch, for example, we know he probably had the largest private library that any individual since antiquity had ever built up. With Chaucer, his education, his background, where he came by, his knowledge is mostly a mystery to us. For instance, by 1387, he had completed work on a translation of Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy. Now, there's a text that Dante had read. There's a text that certainly Jean de Meun knew. There's a text that certainly Petrarch knew. Very, very common text. Very influential text. So Chaucer's interest in it is utterly unsurprising. Okay. The question I would pose, where had he come by his knowledge of Latin? Where had he come by, moreover, his knowledge of other classical texts, other Latin works? It's just very difficult to say. One can appeal to the spirit of the times or something, but as an historian, I'm pretty dubious about appeals like that. Of all works, the one that influenced Chaucer the most was the Romance of the Rose. Indeed, he translated it into English, although only a fragment of Chaucer's own translation survives to this day. He clearly knew other French works as well. He knew the works of other French authors as well. But when we look at this French literature, we are faced, in Chaucer's case, with a quite intriguing paradox. Should we look for specific kinds of textual influences? Chaucer read this book and used it in the following ways. Chaucer read that book and used it in the following ways. Or should we look for a very different kind of influence? Since the Norman conquest of England in 1066, the language of the English aristocracy had been French. It was only in the middle of the 14th century, in 1351, for example, that Parliament was opened for the first time with a speech in English. The language of Parliament was French. The great English law books of the 14th and 15th centuries were French. The language used in the courts of English aristocrats was French. Almost certainly French would have been spoken in the house of Elizabeth, in the court of Elizabeth of Ulster. In other words, for the kind of people among whom Chaucer spent a good part of his life, French was as natural to them as English, maybe more natural than English. So you see what I mean? Do we have to appeal to specific texts that Chaucer sat at his desk and read, or do we appeal to a kind of a general cultural milieu in which he moved comfortably and throughout his life? The works of the Italian triumvirate, Dante, Petrarch, Boccaccio, were beginning by Chaucer's lifetime to gain Europe-wide fame. Sometimes in Italian or Latin, depending on which they had been written in, sometimes in translations, not least, for example, in French translations. Chaucer may very well have known these works. His knowledge of Dante was probably pretty limited. We're going to have occasion to see he knew a bit of Petrarch and he knew a lot of Boccaccio. But where these Italian works are concerned, it appears that Chaucer learned Italian as a young man. It appears he learned it in England and learned it in London as a young man. It may very well be, for instance, that when he was sent on sensitive diplomatic missions to Genoa, that he was sent precisely because he knew Italian. He could speak Italian. Now, as he goes through his career, his works begin to provide more and more and more evidence of direct familiarity with Italian works, certainly those of Petrarch and Boccaccio. But he will perhaps have first acquired his knowledge of these works in a kind of a very general way, just as they were becoming popular, and then only slowly later on did he actually sit down and read them out. The times through which Chaucer lived were particularly fraught. His keen powers of observation must have been exercised by everything that he saw and everything that he experienced. Let me just enumerate some of the major kinds of tensions and problems in Chaucer's world. Attaching any one of these concretely and specifically to any one of Chaucer's works is really difficult. Scholars have tried to do this over the years, but I want just to evoke the kind of world in which Chaucer lived and wrote. England and France went to war in 1346. Chaucer was a little boy. This is the famous 100 Years' War that actually lasted 117 years and had only a few great battles and so on. But anyway, this was a world of war between the French and the English. Chaucer himself was captured and ransomed early in the war. And Chaucer himself served in a couple of key diplomatic missions during the course of this war and relevant to the war. The popes spent the period from 1305 until 1378 in Avignon, in the south of France. The 14th century was a time of acute criticism of the church and of churchmen, of the popes, of the papacy, of the papal government. England and France are at war. The English always felt during the 100 Years' War that the papacy had tipped in favor of the French. The French, of course, always felt that the popes were insufficiently helpful. The popes always felt that they were trying to be honest brokers. But in any case, this may have had an influence on Chaucer. In England itself, there was a very powerful religious movement. We call them the Lollards, the mumblers. That's actually not a modern term for them. That's a term that was applied to them in the 14th century, 14th and 15th centuries. They took their lead in many ways from the theology of John Wycliffe, an Oxford scholar. They called for reform of the church. They called for more direct reading of the Bible. One might, being careful, call it a more evangelical sort of religion that they were calling for. Many have found influences of the Lollards, or have believed that they have found influences of the Lollards in Chaucer's writing. Politically, England saw in 1327 the execution of King Edward II, the accession of the 10-year-old Richard II in 1377, Richard's constant troubles in his deposition in 1399, a time of very considerable political crisis and problems. And remember that Chaucer himself had been patronized by the sons of King Edward III. We've alluded a number of times in our earlier lectures to the Black Death. Well, let us remind ourselves once more that Europe was ravaged by the Black Death in 1348 and 1349. In many places, well, perhaps overall, something like a third of the population of Europe was killed by this appalling plague. In some large and heavily populated areas, the devastation was much greater than that. Now, partly connected with the plague, partly connected with war, partly connected with politics, partly connected with rapacious tax policies of governments, there were a series of social rebellions in the 14th century, the latter years of the 14th century, unlike any that Europe had ever seen before. In 1378, for example, there was one in France and there was another one in the city of Florence. And in 1381, there was the Peasants' Rebellion in England, a major and quite devastating period of at least a few weeks during which England was convulsed. Now, as I say, this is the world in which Chaucer lived. And it's entirely appropriate to think that he will have been influenced by all of these quite remarkable tensions and cross-currents and convulsions. But then to go from that generalization, valid as I think it is, to any specific influence that one can be traced, wow, that's hard. Chaucer was versatile. He was original. He was an artist. He was a consummate artist. So we keep these kinds of background considerations, the cultural milieu in which he grew up, the literary currents to which he would have been subject, the historical forces that marked his time. We just want to keep these in mind, without at any point saying, you see here, this one influences this, and this one produced that story, and this one produced that poem. Chaucer, moreover, covered his own tracks very well. For instance, he may very well have actually been in London when the mob broke into the city. It's not absolutely clear if he was in London at the time, but he certainly was around. He knew about it. There are perhaps, scholars argue about this, 1 or 2 references to the Peasants' War in all of Chaucer's work. Chaucer, we know, mocked and pilloried certain religious figures. But he also told deeply moving, and one might say pious tales too. He had himself a deep personal devotion to the Virgin Mary. He ended more than one of his works with advice to repent. So if Chaucer could criticize the church, he did not criticize religion, per se. We saw that same thing in Boccaccio. Chaucer used irony and satire, sometimes almost savagely, as tools of social commentary. But it's very hard to call him a social critic, and this for several reasons. First of all, he was Catholic in dishing out his criticism. He went after all kinds of people, from rather foolish and stupid peasants to powerful and important people. Beyond that, however, he never sketched out an alternative view of society. One cannot go through Chaucer's work and extract what he thought the world ought to be like. He pillories much of what he sees, but he never tells us the way it ought to be. A 16th century writer, Gavin Douglas, called him every woman's friend. But modern critics, including feminists, have not been able to come to any agreement at all on whether Chaucer was a misogynist, a proto-feminist, or simply a man of his time. Although, for heaven's sakes, it's interesting to think about what that would mean. What does it mean to say that someone is a man of his time? Although Chaucer's fame as a writer grew apace over the course of his life, he seems to have become gradually better and better and better known. His first really significant works are the dream poems, which he composed between about 1371 and about 1394. Now of these, one, The Legend of Good Women, survives only in its prologue. Time constraints force us to omit another, The House of Fame, which is certainly worth attention. But the two that we're going to talk a little bit about are, I think, on general consensus, the finest of Chaucer's dream poems. All right, let's bear in mind that there's nothing unusual about using a dream as the framing device for a story. We've encountered the Romance of the Rose, but certainly we could talk about many other dream poems produced in the Middle Ages, but also in antiquity. It's also important to say that we shouldn't dismiss Chaucer, or be prepared to dismiss Chaucer as derivative because he's using a dream as a frame. All right? The question is, what do you put inside that frame? And Chaucer was remarkably clever in the way he used his dreams. All right, the first of these dream poems, then, to which we'll devote a little bit of attention, is the Book of the Duchess. Now, the Book of the Duchess is almost certainly a work written to commemorate Blanche, the wife of John of Gaunt, another of those sons of Edward III, another of the great patrons of Chaucer himself, who had died young. Blanche had died young in 1368 or 69. The poem runs to about 1,300 lines, divided into three parts. So it's not a work of enormous scope, of enormous scale, of enormous magnitude, like some of the ones that we have encountered already. The first section introduces the narrator, who tells a story, it comes from Ovid, of Ceyx and Alcyone. Ceyx has died at sea. Alcyone knows only that he's failed to return. She doesn't know what his fate has been. She prays for some enlightenment. She prays for some illumination on the matter. Ceyx appears at her bedside in a dream and tells her that he's dead and that she must get on with her life. Now, in Chaucer's telling, Alcyone awakes, and 3 days later, she dies herself. In Ovid's telling, much more romantic really, the lovers are turned into seabirds and spend their time together. One wonders a little why Chaucer here changed Ovid's way of telling the story. Well, in part two, the narrator, who had been reading the story in order to fall asleep, is he having a little shot at Ovid here? Has a dream. Now, in his dream, he awakens. Right? So the dreamer awakens in his dream and is joining a hunt. And then at some point, somewhat unpredictably, he begins to follow a puppy off until he sees a knight, all arrayed in black, sitting under a tree and reciting a mournful lament. The dreamer asks the knight why he's lamenting so, and learns that he has lost his lady love. Her name is White, Blanche. the name of John of Gaunt's wife. The knight goes on at some length, on and on and on, in fact. In scale, it's not a terribly long poem. This is not like the Romance of the Rose, so the knight doesn't give us a 3,000-line speech. And the narrator remarks finally that such lamentation is just unnatural. The dreamer is awakened by the sound of the hunt, which he rejoins. Okay, what do we make of the Book of the Duchess? Well, on one level, it's a story about grief, and about how excessive grief will turn into debilitating despair. Chaucer uses the narrator in the Book of the Duchess more effectively than anyone had ever used a narrator before. And of course, the narrator will play such a great role in the Canterbury Tales. It's going to play an important role in a couple of other works that we're going to talk about here in a couple of minutes. Chaucer is clearly learning his craft here. He's experimenting. He's folding elements into his stories. But, as with the puzzling narrator of the Canterbury Tales, so here, how do we understand this narrator? Is it Chaucer? Is it John of Gaunt? Is it us? Chaucer doesn't tell us. This most courtly of poems, in some ways, has no happy ending. Normally, courtly stories have a happy ending. Now, there are those, Boccaccio's, some of Boccaccio's tales, for example, that don't have happy endings, but generally they do. So is Chaucer here somehow tinkering with the conventions of courtly love? Or is he speaking about how real human beings respond to tragedy? Is that perhaps why he changes Ovid's ending and doesn't give the story a happy ending? He's telling John of Gaunt, yes, it's tragic that Blanche has died, but you must get on with your life. Is the moral for John and for all to remember and to let go? Is the story then somehow an elegant reflection on memory? The second of the dream poems that I want to talk about for a few minutes is the Parliament of Fowls. Now, the Parliament of Fowls is very different in tone and in texture from the Book of the Duchess. Again, we're seeing Chaucer experiment, we're seeing him grow into his craft. We're watching Geoffrey Chaucer become Geoffrey Chaucer. The poem may have been written in connection with Richard II's marriage negotiations between 1377 and 1382, in which Chaucer himself appears to have had a hand. Parliament is Chaucer's most experimental work to date, just in terms of language. It's a very daring work just in terms of its use of language. Now, dreams work in a bunch of different ways in this story. Chaucer's almost having fun with this one. We have a narrator again. The narrator has been reading Macrobius's account of Cicero's account of the dream of Scipio. Okay, now we've encountered all of these works before. We've encountered these authors before. The narrator apparently has not, in reading Macrobius, learned what he wanted to know. He wants to know something about love, you see, but he hasn't learned what he quite wanted to know. So he falls asleep and dreams. Now, in his dream, Scipio, of all people, pushes him through a gate into a kind of a love garden. Hello, here's the Romance of the Rose. Nature presides in this garden, not pleasure, nature, and arrayed before her are all the birds, arrayed hierarchically, from those that eat meat to those that eat seeds. I mean, clearly, Chaucer is sending up human society here. The female eagle is about to choose a mate, and none of the other birds can get on with their own mating until Formal Eagle has chosen her own mate. Now, Formal Eagle has 3 suitors: Royal Eagle and 2 other eagles. The 2 other eagles go on and on and on, comically, we wonder, pressing their case, wooing Formal Eagle. Is Chaucer here having a bit of sport with the wooing of courtly literature? Eventually, nature invites all the birds to adjudicate the matter. All the birds are going to get to vote on who it is that Formal Eagle should accept. Predictably, the birds all go to arguing with each other. They don't agree on who Formal Eagle ought to accept, and they also begin to debate, somewhat unpredictably, on the merits of fidelity. Nature finally tells Formal Eagle, choose for herself, choose of your own free will. and Formal Eagle elects to defer her decision for a year. Nature, however, permits all the other birds to pair off. They do so, and in their happiness and joy they all begin to sing, and their singing awakes the dreamer, who then returns to his books. Okay, the Parliament of Fowls. And the notion of the Parliament, of course, is this debate about whose suit Formal Eagle should accept. Well, the social commentary here is pretty obvious, but it's also pretty obscure. It's Chaucer poking fun at Parliament and the debates in Parliament. He sat in Parliament briefly in his own life. Actually, after he wrote this poem, but he did sit briefly in Parliament. He certainly would have known the workings of Parliament. Is he saying that the behavior of nobles is ridiculous? Is the behavior of nobles elegant? Do nobles, in their self-interest, disturb ordinary people? Does the poem uphold or mock the conventions of courtly love? It's perfectly clear that Chaucer knew those conventions flawlessly. But what's he doing here? Is he sending up courtly love? Or has he written a courtly story? Troilus and Cressade, written 1381 to 86 thereabouts, is Chaucer's longest single poem, and it's the only large-scale work he ever completed. Many critics regard it as Chaucer's finest work, and Chaucer himself thought very well of it. Indeed, near the end, he places himself in the company of Virgil, Ovid, Lucan, and Statius. That's impressive company for Chaucer to insert himself into. And it is just a bit Petrarchan, isn't it? This concern for one's own fame. In simplest terms, the story is a translation of Boccaccio's Filostrato. Now, we met Filostrato already. This is the story of Troiolo and Cressida in Chaucer's, in Boccaccio's Italian. Here we meet it in Chaucer's English as Troilus and Cressade. So the story at Troy, Troilus has fallen in love with Cressade. Cressade goes back to her father Calchas. She then falls in love with Diomede. Troilus is killed on the battlefield by Achilles, and so on. Well, what's interesting about Chaucer's version of this story is that it's being written at almost the exact same time that he's translating Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy. So Chaucer's telling of the tale of Troilus and Cressade has a much more patently philosophical dimension than does, for instance, Boccaccio's telling of the story. Okay? Now, we've met the basic lineaments of the story already, so we don't have to repeat more than the brief summary that I just gave a moment ago. Let's point out a few things, however, that are distinctive about Chaucer's telling and a little different from Boccaccio's. Chaucer adds much greater depth and interest to the characters. He makes Cressade a much more powerful but a much more ambiguous figure. When she goes away, does she kind of cut her losses and reckon that, well, she's never going to get to go back to Troy? And yes, well, she does love Troilus, to be sure, but that's got to be just put behind her. And so getting on with her then love affair with Diomede, is this just good, practical, sensible way of behaving? You see? It's that sort of thing that one meets. The range of critical issues presented by Troilus and Cressade is wide and it's complex. More than in any of his previous works, and rather like what we will see in the Canterbury Tales, the role of the narrator has led to much disagreement. Once again, who is this narrator? Whose point of view does he represent? How are we, the reader, supposed to take the person who is telling us the story? You see? Troilus is a warrior. Then he's a lover. Then he's a warrior again. When Cressade has gone away, Troilus is just lethargic and he can't fight and so on. He is brother to Paris, the lover of all lovers, who's run off with Helen of Troy, got this whole Trojan War business started in the first place. And brother to Hector, the greatest of the Trojan warriors, and maybe the best of the Trojan men. So how do we evaluate this courtly hero? Lover? Warrior? Is love a selfish and irresponsible impulse? Is Troilus's love for Cressade debilitating? Does it make him an ineffective soldier? Does it make him an ineffective Trojan patriot, we might almost say? Is Cressade a credible figure? Or is she a type figure? Is she cleverly self-interested? Is she cynical? Is she mercenary? Is she fickle? Is she a victim of circumstances? You could read her in any one of these ways. Do we get here any sense of that kind of Petrarchan humanism? The idea that there are valuable moral lessons to be learned from classical tales? Well, I hope by now we have at least some little sense of Geoffrey Chaucer, of his complexity and of his interest. And this will serve, I hope then, as a springboard to the last of our lectures in this series on Chaucer's Canterbury Tales.